Welcome to Season 4 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. Today, in episode number 6, we'll be talking with Nilupa Yasmin about unconscious bias. Nilupa Yasmin is an award-winning artist and educator with a primarily lens-based practice. She explores the principles of art and craft and the expanded materiality within photography. Nilupa is interested in the notion of culture, self-identity, and anthropology. While investigating ideals and traditions that are close to home, she draws upon her own identity through gender, religion, and her British-Bangladeshi culture and heritage. An element of her practice focuses on socially engaged photography, and she works collaboratively with various communities to produce and curate works of art. Nilupa's work is included in many permanent and private collections, including the Government Art Collection, the New Art Gallery Walsall, and Birmingham Museum's collection. She is a lecturer in photography at Coventry University and has recently completed her MA in Photography Arts at the University of Westminster. Nilupa is a studio holder at Grand Union, Birmingham. Can we start with you just telling us a little bit about the kind of work that you do?
For me, my work very much speaks about identity, and identity has always been something that I've dabbled with personally in my own work, and I think that's something that has allowed me to start working with other people and working with other communities and different cultures to start thinking about how we situate ourselves in the big world and how the space that we inhabit has so many stories to tell. So I think a big part of my work very much comes around thinking about how representation occurs and how day-to-day lives are presented within the community of people that we live within. I am also really interested in how photography as a medium can be presented to different audiences, but also how as a medium we are expanding constantly. And I feel like my work very much does that, where there's a lot of elements within the works that I'm making and the ways that I'm making my work. But I think for me personally, my work does fit within those realms of thinking about home, thinking about belonging, thinking about identity. And I think a lot of that does come from personal experiences or personal conflicts in some way, and they are then presented into the work that I'm making.
No, that's really interesting. And I think there's a really a growing interest in looking at work that sort of explores identity and representation. And I guess I wonder if you could maybe this is a bit of a challenge, but could you unpack what we mean when we're talking about identity?
I feel like identity in so many different ways is a sum of the people that we are. And that can be part of the cultural upbringing that we have, the social class that we're part of, the age that we are. I mean, everything's constantly changing around us in the world. So it's always really important to see how our identity is changing along with that. I think for me, one of my first bodies of work that I did that really started to depict identity was Grow Me a Water Lily, where it was very much, it came from this idea of having this personal conflict between where does my identity situate itself? And it was always one of those things that I found that I was always too British to be part of a Bangladeshi society, but then at the same time, I was too Bangladeshi to be fully British. So I always found that conflict within myself that I wanted to explore on further. So I think that's kind of where identity kind of started to form and shape for me. And when it came to working with others, I found that the questions that I was struggling to answer myself, those were the questions I was asking people. And suddenly I found that that became the almost foundation of questions and conversations that I had with complete strangers, because suddenly you realize that even though I've barely met this person, there is still that one little part of their conflict that feels home to me. And we almost kind of bond within our conflicts that we have about identity. So I think for me, I feel like it's a very big word, and it's a really big word to very much define into one specific sentence and what identity means. Because for me, what identity means right now was not what it meant 5 years ago and probably won't be what it means in 5 years' time. And I think that is very much thinking about how much I've grown as a person, my age, my circumstances, my situations. So I always am really curious to see how that's changing for others and how that's changing in a way that is both positive and negative. But it just depends on the kind of audience that you're working with.
Absolutely. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that's a really great, actually, a really great overview of what we mean when we're talking about identity. And so with your work, you do a lot of community workshops. So I guess you're approaching different ideas of belonging and identity through the community workshops. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. I've been quite fortunate that community-based workshops are something that I've dabbled a lot of my hand in working within. And I think I first started off with, I was almost kind of thrown in the deep end with the project right at the beginning when I first graduated. And I think that's really started to push me to see that this is the style of work that I want to make. And this is almost, there's so many stories that are out there that need to be told, and there's not someone telling them already. And I think that's one of the reasons why I felt like it was important to, take that time out and make those images and connect with those different people in different ways. But I think for me, a lot of that style of work very much started from university. So when I was doing my BA in Coventry, I did a BA photography. And as the name suggests, it's very much thinking about working with others, working with photography as a tool of participation, as a tool of engagement. And I think starting a project within that university environment, having that very safe-knit space to be able to make work with people really pushed me into really trying to see what kind of work I'm really interested in making, but also how to effectively work with people. And I remember there's been kind of a lot of journeys that I've had throughout university that have stuck with me a lot since. And I think that module and a lot of the teachings from that module have really sat in terms of resonating with me in terms of the practice that I have right now. And even now, I'm still doing a lot of things that like my lecturers kind of drilled into you at that point. So I feel like that's something where a lot of my practice in terms of participatory work began. But I think in many ways, so when I first started that project, it was a project that I was doing with a group of children who were part of a creche, and their moms would come and learn ESOL classes in the room next door. So they were learning English as an additional language next door. And I was sitting here working with the kids, and it was purely volunteer basis. And I was just really interested in getting them to engage in an activity, trying to get them to see what art is. And I think there's that kind of taboo about, am I an artist if I'm learning how to paint or if I'm learning how to draw? And I think that was something that was quite friendly in that environment. And I remember, I think I did like 5 sessions with them, and I set them a task every session and we did it together. And I think before the final session, I remember coming back to uni and I was telling my lecturer, and participatory photography at Coventry University was taught by Anthony Luvera. So he was my tutor at the time. And I remember coming and saying to Anthony, I'm going to set them a task where they go home and photograph, and I'm going to get them to like send the images back to me. And bearing in mind, these were around children who were about 6, 7 in age. And I remember saying, I was like, this is the task we're going to set them, and it's going to be the final one, and it's going to be like the last page of my zine, and it's all going to make sense. And I remember him turning around and he's saying to me how, Nilupa, what makes you think that they have the means to take that photograph and send it to you? I remember sitting there and I was like, no, just take a picture on a camera and just send it. And he was like, yeah, but what makes you think that they have the means to do that? And I think that really clicked with me in that moment, where I think my opinion about accessibility changed so much then. And I remember thinking about it, like even now when I'm planning a workshop now, and I tend to think, I'm like, okay, wait, I've got to, have scissors, and I've got to have glue sticks, and I've got to have all of this. And I'm like, why do I think that organizations will have that? Or why do I think people will have that at home? So I think that's something that's really stuck on with me. But it was one specific phrase that Anthony said to me, was that you need to be conscious of your unconscious bias. And it's something that's really stuck with me ever since, because I found that in that moment, my unconscious bias was that you have a phone at home that you can take a photograph with and you can just email it over to me. And I just remember thinking to myself, okay, wait, why did I assume that everyone would have a smartphone that they can take a picture in? Because originally I was like, you don't need a camera, you just have a phone. But again, why did you think that someone does have a phone? And I think it was one of those things that Anthony sat me down, and he did it in a way, and he was just like, but you have a phone at home, but how many people do you know that don't have a phone at home? And it's almost this kind of like reverse way of thinking about how the different people that we meet and the different needs that they have, whether or not a phone is a necessity to people. So I think that's I would kind of say that was my defining moment in some way, that really changed the way that I saw what participatory photography is. And the fact that as the photographer and as the person that's holding the camera, I have so much power in me in that moment, and I need to be careful about how I'm using that and whether or not, what kind of preconceived ideas that I have about certain things, am I using that in the work that I'm making? And if so, how accurate is that to the people that I'm working with? And how accurate is that? And how safe is it in so many ways? So I think those are the little things that I found over the years, and even doing a lot of participatory projects over different age groups, different learning abilities. I think it's something that I've really been able to hold on to as I've gone by. So yeah.
That's really interesting. Absolutely. I mean, I think I can so see that, our sort of assumption that, yeah, people will be able to engage in this way because that's, I could engage in that way. And that's something that seems accessible to everybody, but isn't really. So I can imagine, I can also imagine Anthony delivering that in a very compassionate way. We had him on the podcast recently, and I think he's very good at negotiating those conversations. So I can picture that definitely.
Yeah, I think it definitely was one of those things, because I remember later on, after I had graduated, I remember bumping into Anthony in one of the commissions that I was doing at the time. And I remember telling him about, I'm working with these people and I'm doing all these things. And he was just like, are you still conscious, Nilupa? And I was like, yes, Anthony, I'm still conscious.
And I wonder, are there any other things, I'm quite interested in this because you said that there are things that your lectures really drilled into you that still guide your practice. Are there other things like that that sort of have really shaped how you approach either the community projects or your own work, either from the university or elsewhere?
I would say that I've been really fortunate with my art school education. I know that I've read the stories. Not everyone has had a positive experience in art school, especially being someone of colour. And I think I've been really fortunate that I've been on the other end of the scale, that I had lecturers who were very much invested in my work and invested in me as much as I was. And I think that's something that really showed because of the passion that they had for the work that I was making. But also in so many ways, they very much nourished me to kind of start thinking about how this work fits in the real world, and how, even though it's very comfortable right now to be having these conversations with them, how am I going to be having these conversations when I leave? And I think another conversation I recall when I was in my third year, I remember I make a lot of pretty work. I'm not going to deny that. I feel like the work that I make, even if someone doesn't understand what the context behind it is, the one thing that they take away from it is the fact that, oh, this looks really pretty and it looks very beautiful and it's very elegant in the way that it's made. And I mean that a lot in the handcrafted works that I make. And there's this whole entire history about the way that we deal and engage with craft as individuals. But I remember in my final year when I was making my really big body of work around my own identity, and I had this tutorial with Matt, who was one of my lecturers at the time, and he very much sat me down and he was like, but why are you doing this, Nilupa? And what does that mean? But why should someone care about it? And why does it matter? And I think I remember right at the end of the conversation, I got to the point and I was like, yeah, it's pretty, but that's what's going to drag people into the work and actually sit there and listen to it. And I think it took that entire conversation of why and what and how and who to kind of get me to that point where I realized that this is really important for me to be very vocal about. Otherwise, no one's going to understand. People will stop at that conversation where it's really pretty and just move on. And I saw that a lot when the work was exhibited. And since then, every time that same piece of work is exhibited, I see it a lot because people will come up to me and say, I really relate to that work, or I resonate with that image, or, you wearing that specific outfit there is connecting me to something that my mom wore. So there's little things like that where I feel like my lecturers really did kind of push into me. And I feel like I do that quite a lot now with the practice that I've established, but also with the teaching that I do. I feel like it's almost become a whole round circle for me, that I'm really fortunate that what I was taught was so positive that I'm able to pull that back into the way that I teach now. So there have been quite a few little snippets like that. But I think in terms of thinking about representation, there's been this one thing that's really stuck with me for a while now. Now, when I first started off making work about me and making work about representation, I was very naive in the way that I would describe this work. I very easily would just turn around and say, well, my work represents British, Bangladeshi, Muslim women. And I said that for a long time. And I'm sure there's texts and interviews of me saying this at different various points. And when I think back to it now, and I was just like, no, it doesn't, Nilupa. It does not represent that. And I think my little turning point was where I was part of a panel discussion. And in the panel discussion, the one commonality that all the panelists had was that we were South Asian. And we were talking about this kind of idea of what representation means to us and how representation as a whole has been defined and changed. And, how do we as artists situate ourselves within that term? And in the panel discussion, there was a Kathak dancer called Seetal Kaur. And we were all having this conversation about, what do we really represent when we say that I'm representing so-and-so? And she turned around and she said this one statement, and I use it in every artist talk now because it sat with me so, like, it's become such an important part of what I believe my practice is now. And she turned around and she said, you can only represent yourself really in the work that you're making. And it's very dangerous to have that mentality that you're representing all South Asians when there are so many marginalized communities within South Asia. But that's not to say don't make the work. We still can offer a window into these communities. And I think when she said that, and I remember sitting there on the other side of my Zoom screen, and I was like, that just really feels like what I have been doing. I have just never realized that is what I've been doing. And I think it was really important for someone at some point. It wasn't directed to me personally. It was just a comment that was made in the space that we were talking about. But she specifically said that it's very dangerous to say that, you're representing all South Asians. So for me to just turn around and say I'm representing British Bangladeshi Muslim women, that's a very dangerous term to use, because I, for one, do not represent everyone. But at the same time, I do represent some. And I think for me to kind of get to that point in realizing that it's important to still have that conversation and still make the work, but be careful about how you're wording it, because, as someone who identifies in a specific way, it's not to say that every single British Bengali woman would, every single British Bengali Muslim woman would, every Muslim woman would. So I think it's really important to kind of understand that and understand how you're wording your own projects and how you're talking about them to different people. Because I think over the years, I've learned that representation is such a big term that I'm very cautious about the way that I use it and the way that I situate it with my work. I feel like that's been one of the things that has really influenced the way that I'm making work. And even now, I find that it's definitely something that I feel becomes a part of the conversations that I have with people, especially when, someone turns around and says they feel like this work belongs to them, or they feel like this work in some way is a part of home for them. It's really humbling to listen to that. And I think that's one of the reasons why it keeps me keep making, rather than just turning around and be like, okay, this is it. I just don't want to make this kind of work anymore. It's one of the things that keeps pulling me back, because I'll meet people who say that it represents them in some way, or just simply someone turning around and saying that, you look familiar to me, or I recognize you from somewhere. And they never do, but it's just really nice to have that kind of connection to people in different spaces. And I think a lot of it comes from those teachings and comes from the little things that I've learned over the years.
That's really interesting. And I really like that sort of analogy about like providing a window into. I think that's really nice. And I think it all sort of also goes back to maybe the way you described identity earlier as being very intersectional, right? As, your identity as someone who's also of a certain age, will be obviously different from how someone else's experience who maybe is older or is from a different socioeconomic background or something. So I think that's a really interesting framing, and I'm sure a really useful framing as well for people in thinking about how we're describing our work. Because I guess it is that balance as well between wanting to create work that is relevant for other people. And it isn't just, I don't know, I think I've said this in another episode, but like I sometimes worry that my work is too like navel gazing. You know what I mean? That it's too much introspection or too much about myself, or, and so I can imagine that, people saying like, this looks, this relates to me. Like I remember this, like you said, from my mother had an outfit like that or something, I can imagine that would be very validating.
Mm. I feel that a lot. I think recently I've been having this kind of conversation with myself and just in general about imposter syndrome and what that means. And especially when it comes to the art that you're making, but also the people that you're meeting. And I feel like, so when I started to make work with others and I started to kind of produce work collaboratively with other people, I used to feel like, I don't think I'm the right person to be doing this. I don't feel like I'm qualified enough or like old enough to be doing this. And I feel like the more people that I went on to meet, and I started to realize that my voice was important, and and it comes back to that idea, I was a familiar face. And I think that that was something that resonated with a lot of people, and it became a lot easier to talk to people about. And it's not to say that all the works that I have done are within like South Asian communities or within communities that look like me. Simply just going into a group of women and, you know, people who identify as women and having certain conversations, that starts to bring about a lot of different things that you realize, even though you've been feeling them, it's become vocal in a room full of people. So I think that's definitely something that I've really seen. And in a way, I feel like there are a little inklings to positive imposter syndrome, but it's definitely something that as artists, I feel like has become quite prevalent, especially in the day in society that we live in right now. And I think that really starts to make you think about the communities that you are working with and just being very respectful and understanding towards the people that you're working with. So even if a project is starting off with yourself, it starts to become this kind of intergenerational part of other people's lives. But yeah, I definitely think sometimes it's a lot easier just making work about me. And I found that a little cheat system is making it quite obvious, whether it's in the artist statement or whether it's in the work that I'm making, that this work is still first and foremost about me. And I think it's easier in that way to say anything I want to because I'm saying it about me. And I'm not in any way offending anybody else. So I'm not making a statement that I don't know about. So it's very easy for us to make statements that we think are right and then later on realize, okay, that was not the right thing to say. So I think being able to make work about myself and just simply saying, you know what, I started this work because I really didn't like this, or I started this work because I was struggling with this. So those things really start to help in terms of situating the work and the practice that you're making.
You mentioned that a lot of your work is very beautiful, and I will attest to the fact that it is very beautiful, beautiful work. And one thing that you've done quite a lot in your work is incorporating weaving. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because I just find that really, really fascinating. I really enjoy looking at your work.
Thank you. I still remember that conversation. It was Matt actually who said to me, he was like, it's very beautiful work and it's very pretty, but what does it mean? And he knew what it meant. He just needed me to say what it meant. But I think, again, it's something that I've really taken credit for over the years. I think when I first graduated as a student, it would really annoy me when someone said the work was pretty because, yeah, it's pretty, but like, there's so much history behind this. There's so much, like, you know, there's a lot of stories behind this. But I originally started weaving as part of a project that I was doing in Coventry as a student. And the project asked us to work with a community in Coventry to produce a body of work. So I ended up working with Foleshill, which is in Coventry. And the ribbon weaving industry thrived in Foleshill in Coventry when it first began in England. And there is a lot of rich history around ribbon weaving that is currently part of Coventry's history, and you can, you know, view it in the Herbal Art Gallery. So I almost fell into Foleshill as an area, and I was really interested in the history there. I think personally, I wasn't interested in the weaving history as much as I was interested in the fact that migration in that area and the fact that there was pretty much anyone and everyone from all over the world that live on that one road. And I think that's one of the things that really drew me into the area. And I started thinking about how the different spaces in that area really inhabited the people who were there. I mean, you know, you had food shops of foods all around the world that are just dotted around, clothes shops that are dotted around. So I was just really interested in that. And it was from that research that I realized that the history of ribbon weaving and how that was becoming a part of Coventry's landscape, but also thinking about how England was in so many other different countries at that same time and how those histories were being passed into the landscape of English history. And I think for me, it was just really interesting to think about a lot of the people who had migrated, and majority of the people in Foleshill had migrated after the Second World War, and the landscape of the area and the amount of people that were there, a lot of them, I don't think realised that the history of the place that they lived in right now was embedded in the history that they've come from. And a main reason behind that is because of the colonial history that England holds. And I remember walking into so many different fabric shops that were owned by people from India, and they had no inclination of the fact that the ribbon weaving history that was in Foleshill at the time was in line with a lot of the things that were happening with the British Raj in India at the same time. So when you start thinking and, you know, drawing the facts together, there's nothing written like this in history, but you can't not think about the fact that this was happening in one specific place at one time, and then in correlation, it was happening in a completely different space at a different time. So there's a lot of connections between that. But I think that's where the weaving first began, where I started to weave some of my images. And I think having those conversations with the people who own the stalls in Coventry, suddenly seeing their images woven together and them looking really nice and really pretty, that kind of began an entire conversation and story and connection with the people that I was meeting. And I was able to, like, later on, 2-3 years, go back, and I was commissioned to make work again with Folesville. So it was a really nice connection to build with them. But I think it was in that project where as usual, you're sitting in the living room and you're weaving, and your mom walks past and she's like, oh, my grandma used to do that. And that was the light bulb moment. And from then onwards, I learned that my great grandmother used to weave utilitarian objects, and she made a living out of them. And it's hilariously ironic to think that so many years on, I'm doing the exactly same thing, making a living out of weaving. But I don't think in any of her dreams did she imagine me to be doing it in the way that I'm doing it. And I think that's one of the reasons why I feel like it's so much more special to me, because I realized the fact that as a craft form, it's become something that my great grandmother used to, feed her family with. And so many years on, I'm using it to make a living out of, to, expand my practice. But also, I think that really began my research into craft and the history of craft, and thinking about how craft as a whole is situated within arts history. And, once you start looking into that, you start thinking about the gender roles that they are within craft forms, and how you associate specific craft forms to specific genders. And, there have been many times where I've met someone, and majority of the time it has been of the older generation, who would just be like, oh, you're making this and it's really nice, but they don't see it as art. They just refuse to see this as art. And they're like, oh, so do you do this in your spare time? And I'm like, yes, but I also make a living out of it. So I think it's become one of those things that the more people I've met, I've realized that the history and the research that I've been reading up on, how it's still current today. Like, even now, I mean, I have people who I've grown up with who think that I just literally just weave on the weekends, and that's all I do. And it's completely fine. I think a lot of it comes from this kind of history that we have of what we consider weaving to be, or just any craft form to be. So I think I very much started off it as a technique that I was really interested in, which then later on became quite a big part of my own family history. And I feel like now I'm at that point where I've kind of come to a point where I've realized that there's so much history in weaving, and there's so much interest and thought given to the craft that we disregard because it's part of the arts and craft movement, not necessarily the art movement. So I think there's so many ways that we could kind of have this conversation about craft forms as a whole. But I think I've seen the benefits the craft form has had on many, many different occasions for different projects that I've worked on. I mean, recently I finished off a project where we used craft forms as a way of mental health and well-being. So it was really nice to see how that work has very much established itself within the projects that I've worked with, but also the fact that it's becoming one of those things that people are recognizing. People are recognizing that weaving is important, or just craft forms are important in different ways, and how that can be used as a tool for mental health and well-being, and getting people to connect together. I mean, the history of weaving is when villages would come together and weave big items, or blankets and different things. And I think one of my favorite stories to tell is that when a man is weaving together a fence to protect his family, that's seen as like, that's a manly, really, important thing to do. But when the same when the same thing is being done inside the house, where a woman is weaving together a blanket to protect a family, that's just seen as women's work. And I think it's that term women's work that I've come across so much throughout the history and research that I've been doing, that it's really started to kind of resonate in so many different ways, how we as individuals connect to the craft form because of the way that it's been kind of passed down to us. So sitting at home and stitching is just women's work, but when like suddenly a man is stitching his photographs and putting them in big mainstream galleries, oh my god, that's amazing. And I think again you see that a lot, and it's something that's kind of advanced through time. I feel like it hasn't died down yet, but I also feel like people still consciously do it, and they don't realize that they're doing it because they have that kind of bias in them. It's the unconscious bias, that's what it is. They have that in them where they just assume that no, it's a man's work and it's a woman's work. So I think that's kind of where a lot of the weaving history has come from.
That's really interesting. And I think as well, it's really there's so many, it's multi-layered, isn't it? That, there's sort of obviously a gender element to it. There's also I'm sure, a class element to it and a way of thinking about, what constitutes, who can be an artist and what constitutes art. And daring to present things as art that are often not considered as in the fine art sense, that are considered in more of a craft sense. So I think that's really, there's a lot to think about there. And I guess in my mind, it seems like there might be an ethical dimension as well to your work, in that you're challenging those things. Does that resonate, or am I sort of overlaying my ethical framework?
No. No. I feel like it was always something that I feel like a lot of bodies of work that I make, and ones that I feel like are some of my better projects and best projects, have been done from something that I've absolutely hated, or I've been like, I really don't like this, and we need to make work on this so that I can, channel my anger into the work that I'm making. And I feel like a lot of the times, I've even when it's not doing weaving workshops, I still will try and like talk about these terms with different people, because a lot of the time people just don't understand the history behind craft forms and how ethically they are driven in so many different dimensions and so many different barriers. And I think that's something that I try and implement a lot in the workshops that I do. So especially when you're doing like a schools workshop, it's really important to start teaching those kids that we're going to do weaving, but this is not a boys or a girls thing. This is a universal thing, and it's a good skill to have. And I think that's something that I found that, as years have gone by, and every time I've done a weaving workshop, depending on the group and depending on the age range and ability of the participants, how much I can really push in my pro weaving agenda into these workshops. But I think it's definitely been one of those things where I've been approached for projects where people don't necessarily want to do the weaving, but they want to know what I want to say about the weaving, or what I want to teach about the weaving. And that's always really humbling, because I feel like, so my dissertation paper was on thinking about craft forms, and I was very proud of this, and it was called "It's Time to Let the Crafters Out the Cupboard." That was the title of my dissertation, and it's the most proudest thing I've ever done. And I think that was one of the things that really made me sit down and think about why weaving. What is about the weaving? Yeah, it's pretty, but what does that mean? So there were all these kind of things that came in with the work. But I definitely think that craft as a form of activism is really important, and it's really important to kind of see how the history of craft has been so heavily, infused in activism, and using that in so many different ways. The fact that, so many years on later, we're still doing that, we're still using craft as that specific thing. And I think especially now in the day and age that we live in, and the way that, how everything around us has changed the way that we see the world, I think it's even more important now to hold on to those craft forms, because it's what I've found really benefits people, and it really benefits people to just sit down and make. And sometimes just making for the sake of just having a bit of fun is really integral, and that really brings together so many different conversations that you don't necessarily have if you were just, getting a group of people to write down their thoughts, because sometimes you don't want to write it, you want to talk about it, and you want to while you're doing something. And I think for me, it's always been really interesting that in every single weaving workshop that I've ever done, I know the history of whose aunt ran away with whose uncle, what the neighbour's doing, where the dog went to the morning after. Like, it's anything and everything that we speak about. But I think it's that very safe and homely environment that you get when you're performing something with your hands, that you can just talk and, you can share what's in your mind and what's in your thoughts. But I think a lot of that, again, comes to this kind of idea of safeguarding. So I think it's just really important to think about when, especially you're working with people, that you're equipped to be working in that environment, and that you have the right kind of training to be able to do that.
Yeah, I think that leads really well to my next question, which is, do you, or have you encountered very many sort of ethical dilemmas in the course of either your personal work or your workshop work? And maybe that's a safeguarding issue, or maybe it's something else. And how have you dealt with that?
I can't think of a specific ethical dilemma that I've had. But I think my one moment that clicks is that one moment that I had as a student, when I was assuming that accessibility is the same for everyone as it is for me. And I think that's something that's really stuck on with the work that I've made, because it's almost kind of one of those things that has made you reevaluate the way that you're making work. And in so many ways, I've not realized that I've done this consciously since, where every time I'm working with a new group of people and I haven't had any experience working with them, or I don't know how to work with them, like I know my craft and I know how to teach them how to work with something. But at the same time, your ability is different to my ability. Therefore, a lot of the times I might not be able to deal with that correctly, or I might not be able to give you the right kind of support that I want to. So I think I've been quite fortunate that training is something that has been implemented in so many different commissions that I've worked with. And I think it's when you're working in workshop environments and you're working with participatory driven work, I think there's this kind of element of training that needs to be opted into. And so many times you'll be surprised as artists that organizations have these in place, or they at least have someone within them that has that training that they can pass that on to you. But it's one of those things that we don't think about asking. So when we're not asking, we're not knowing. And the same way, we don't realize that, okay, wait, if you don't know how to work with a group of people, it's completely and perfectly fine to turn around and say, I know my skill, but I just have never worked with X group of people. So I think it's something that I really encourage people to really have conversations with the organizations that they're working with, the companies that they're working with, because sometimes you'll be surprised that things that they have funding in place for is training and training the people that they're working with. And sometimes you'll be surprised that there's more funding for training than there is for materials. And it's great in a way, but you just don't know that until you've had that conversation. I mean, I've over the years had quite a bit of training around mental health, safeguarding for different age ranges. So I've worked with like 5-year-olds to 65-year-olds. So it's, working with different communities, but also thinking about the fact that when you're working with vulnerable adults, the things you can and can't say, the things that you need to understand are risk factors. So there's things like that where I've worked with other artists as well in different environments. And I've realized that, just literally sitting there and having a conversation with them. And I'm like, you've not had this safeguarding conversation yet, have you? Because you can just tell from the way that you speak to people. So the way that you articulate yourself to a group of participants really goes to show how they connect to you. And sometimes you have to be really careful, because if you know that you're in a setting with vulnerable adults, it's even more important to make sure that they understand that you are someone who's coming into that space to make work with them, but not necessarily someone that is a support worker for them, or someone who is in any way caring for them. And I think and as artists, we do that where you have to make that fine line between yourself, because you have to keep yourself safe. But in so many ways, you're keeping your participants safe by keeping yourself safe, and you're putting these things into perspective. But I think it's definitely something that you have to, as an artist, do for your own development, do for your own kind of personal training. But it's definitely something that I really encourage people that try and get it done, try and ask organizations. I mean, there's always different companies that are running safeguarding training that you can be a part of. I think a couple of years ago, I did a commission with RSA Academy Schools and Innova. And I remember part of the commission, when I applied for it, it said that you get to work with an arts therapist. And I remember I was like, I've never done this. And I'm like, this was really exciting. So I remember working, Prabs, who was the arts therapist that I got to work with. It was incredibly important to kind of gain that insight from her, because she was able to kind of sit me down and tell me about like different things that worked, different things that didn't work for different ages. And I think I find that even now, so many years on, there are different things that she taught me that I feel like I use still. And I think that's also one of the things that you really need to be careful about in terms of, constantly educating yourself. I feel like I know a lot about weaving, but it might just be that one of the things working in a participatory environment, you need that extra skill and you need that extra support. And there is no shame in saying that you don't know how to do it and getting that, rather than going into a space head first and just struggling to kind of situate yourself within that. But I think it's definitely important to be trained in different environments and thinking about access needs in spaces, because it's something that, organizations can provide. There is no harm in asking. There is no harm in admitting the fact that, I don't have training to deal with autistic individuals. So how do we do that? Or I don't have training to do specific things. And you'll actually be surprised how feasible it is to have those conversations with organizations, because at the end of the day, they want what's better for you to be able to carry on making that work. And at the end of the day, a lot of this comes to the fact that you're working with others. It's not just you sitting in your studio and making work. You're working with people, and what you say and what you do really does affect the people that you're working with. So I think it's definitely something that I feel like has become a part of the work that I make, and it's something that I'm constantly kind of working within and encouraging in others that I see. But also, I feel like that's probably one of the reasons why I've avoided quite a few ethical dilemmas, because of kind of knowing and understanding what safeguarding is in place. And you could have safeguarding in place in a group of 65-year-olds as opposed to having, safeguarding in a group of 5-year-olds. So there's a lot of different things that you can kind of counteract when it comes to things like this. But yeah, I think that's definitely one of the things that I would just really encourage people to get on board with, trying to get as many different training skills in, under their belt.
I think that's tremendously brilliant, like, advice. I think that's really, really important. It's something that I don't think I've heard people talk very much about. So I think that's, I don't know. I think that's really, really useful, and definitely gives me a lot of food for thought. And I'm sure will give a lot of people listening something to think about. So thank you very much for that. The last question that I like to ask everyone is, what does photography ethics mean to you?
So photography ethics is something that is constantly changing. And I feel like a lot of this podcast has been about that. It's about this kind of change that's happening around us. But I think one thing that I would say, and again, it comes back to the same one phrase. And I think it's really being conscious about the world around you, and things are always changing and we are always learning new things. And as photography, especially as a medium, is constantly changing. There's so many new ways of making. So for me, ethics is having that common ground of understanding with the people that you're working with, or the subject that you're working with. It doesn't necessarily have to be people, but it's also understanding that there is a lot of power in the camera. And while you're the one that's pointing at another, you need to have that understanding in who they are and what they are comfortably sharing with you. If you're pointing a camera at somebody else, don't ever assume that it's your story you're telling. It's not, it's them. You're just, using that as an apparatus to actually do that. But always understand that power that is within those spaces. But also thinking about never diving in head first. If you don't know something, read about it, learn about it, talk to people, educate yourself beforehand so that you are at the best version of yourself to be able to work with others. But also always remember that you're working with real people and real life issues. And that's something that even if you walk away from that space after doing your project, that is still a real life situation for someone, and that is still a real life experience for someone. But also, I feel like personally, it's one of those things that if you feel like you have a personal ethical dilemma towards a project that you're working with, please talk to someone. Please talk to the people that, inspire you. For me, I started off doing a lot of projects around as a university student. So I had that safety net around me. But even now, I know quite a few different artists that I can have those conversations with if I'm ever feeling like I don't know whether or not this is the right project for me. It's also one of those things to always remember that if I don't, then no one else will. So I've always been quite fortunate to be part of a community, a culture that there are so many stories to tell and that there's not enough of us doing it. And that is in no way to say that there's not, that we don't exist and that people aren't doing it. There's a whole entire village of us who are, making this style of work. But the village is never big enough. And I think that's one of the things that I always kind of constantly bang on about, where I'm in no way ever going to say that I'm the only South Asian woman to be making work around South Asian people. There are a lot of us, but there's just not enough of us. And that's probably one of the reasons why I don't put the camera down and I don't want to not make the work, because, you're only that little tiny part of the village and it takes a lot of us to kind of get to this point. So I think it's just being conscious at different varying points and always understanding that these are real people that you're working with. And like Anthony Luvera said, be conscious of your unconscious bias, because I think it's something that I've really resonated with over the years, especially when you're working with a community that you relate to. So especially when I'm working with a group of Bangladeshi women who, I'm doing a workshop with, it's so easy for me to kind of get back into that rift and think that, oh, you know what, like maybe their lives are like my mom's life, or maybe their lives are like my life or my auntie's life, or, various other people that I know of, because for me, they resonate that same kind of connection. But it's always important to be conscious that, just because this person is of the same age range as my mom and has come to the country at the same time as she did and, is married with the same number of kids, doesn't mean that this is my mom's life. And it's really important to kind of put put that into yourself beforehand. So I think those are the little things that I feel like really resonate when it comes to thinking about how we situate ourselves ethically. So, don't not make the work, do make the work. Just be conscious about the work that you are making and conscious about who the person or the subject is on the other end.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photoethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. You can also rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Join me next week when we hear from Morwenna Kersley on ethics as comfort. In each episode of the podcast, we ask our guests, what does photography ethics mean to you? This is a question that everyone in the photography industry should be able to answer. That's why the Photography Ethics Center is asking you, our listeners, to commit to writing and publishing your own statement of ethics. Visit www.photoethics.org/ethics to learn more and to make the pledge committing to ethical transparency, accountability, and awareness. That's www.photoethics.org/ethics.